Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Evan Friss. I'm a professor of history at James Madison University, which is in Virginia, and the western part of Virginia here in the Shenandoah Valley. And hope everybody's having a good evening. It's only 1 o'clock here. The sun's out, and it's a delightful day. So I've been invited to talk to you about my book, which is a history of the bookshop as an institution in the United States, its history, and why bookstores have been and remain vital parts of American life and culture. So I'm going to talk for a bit and save some time at the end for questions, and look forward to hearing what you're interested in and maybe learning a bit about Russian bookstore history and culture, which I know nothing about. So I have some slides here to share, and we'll start with those. All right. So when I was researching this book, I visited as many bookstores as I could, and one of which the images here derive from is called Word Up, which is in the northern knob of Manhattan from a neighborhood known as the Little Dominican Republic. A lot of Spanish-speaking people, and this was a bilingual bookstore that was actually started as a nonprofit. And they have books that are new and used, and books where customers can pay as much as they can afford. This is a shop that encourages people to engage in civic affairs much more broadly. So I'm inside this bookstore browsing and interviewing the owner, and in comes a regular customer. His name is Noble. And the owner tells me I should go talk to Noble because he had spent a career working in various bookstores across the United States. So I went up to him and asked him if I could interview him for my book. And he looked me up and down and said no. So I walked away, but a few minutes later, he circled back and he said, "You know what? Bookstores are weird." And I thought that was a great way of kind of conjuring what makes these institutions so different or unique, or some would say special or magical. And that's really the main question I'm trying to answer in this book, is how have bookstores played a unique role in American history, and why do people have such distinct relationships with them compared to other kinds of stores? At least here in the United States, people who are readers often have an affinity for their local bookstore. People often talk about having, my bookstore in a way that doesn't really correspond to grocery stores or electronics stores or furniture stores or the like. So what I'm really going to try and do in this talk is highlight over the course of American history what's been special about American bookstores. And the first key theme really is about community. And I'm going to start by reading a section from the opening of the book itself. 3 Lives and Company is a 650 square foot bookshop on a corner in New York City's West Village. Along the hand-carved shelves and glowing under Jolly Rancher green lamps, there's fiction and non, front list and back list, picture books and cookbooks, history and travel, art and architecture, Granta and graphic novels, the Paris Review, and all things New York. The dog treats are behind the counter. Over on the lone stool, you'll probably see Abel, one of the regulars. You might also spot Camille, who always remembers to ask about ailing grandmothers or soon-to-be graduating nephews, and Greg, a writer who could be mistaken for a rugby player. Richie, an unwavering football fan, stops by habitually, often with a wedge of Gruyere. Toby owns the bookshop outright, Yet he doesn't think of it as his shop. He says he's merely the custodian. It is the bookshop, not Toby, that has a relationship with the customers. Likewise, Abel, Camille, Greg, Richie, the procrastinating writers and editors, the dogs and their walkers, Dr. Gary, the rheumatologist who once diagnosed a bookseller with shingles over by the biographies, Henry, a Broadway composer who makes melodies from random lines and random books, and the parade of volunteers who help wrap gifts in December and share popcorn tins and chocolate bars hidden under the counter, are all referred to by the same title, Friends of the Shop. They have an attachment to the shop and the shop to them. Sometimes loved ones will phone with news that a longtime customer has died. The bookstore ought to know. Three Lives isn't just another retail outlet. The quintessential shop around the corner is part of what makes the village feel like a village. It has charm, personality, and soul. More than anything, Toby doesn't want to screw it up. And I start this book inside of Three Lives, in this bookstore that you can see some images of, because it was there that I fell in love with bookstores, in large part because I was in love with a bookseller. My then girlfriend and now wife lucked into a job at this small independent bookshop that turned out to be one of the most famous independent bookstores in the United States. And over time, I saw this as a place that was not just transactional, but was really a hub, a community. The draw was, of course, primarily or principally, or at least the first impulse was the books themselves. But the draw was as much the people, the staff, the customers, local authors who would swing by, Vaughn, the driver who delivered books to the shop, and all the rest. So I'm going to now go back in time and trace some of the evolution to how bookstores became this kind of anchor of community, how they became anchors of community. And I'm going to start in 1828 in Boston, Massachusetts, at a place called the Old Corner Bookstore. And it represented an important shift in the history of bookstores because it was one of the first to really embrace this concept of community. So I'm going to read another short bit from the book here. In the building on the corner of Washington and School, editors clutched stacks of manuscripts, printers scurried about in ink-stained clothes, publishers flipped through invoices, and poets browsed shelves of verse. The writers who frequented the Boston bookstore / print shop / publishing enterprise weren't just the usual aspiring sort. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Harriet Beecher Stowe came to talk religion, music, theater, and philosophy. United States senators came to talk about books. Nathaniel Hawthorne preferred not to talk at all. Customers described the scene as a lounge and resort, the place to learn what new books are forthcoming. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who regularly made the trip over from Cambridge, relished it all. The loiterers were the makers of books as well as readers. Not everyone was famous. Anyone could walk in off the street, browse, and strike up a conversation. The store was a de facto public space, a meeting space, a communal space that wasn't a house or church or political hall. In those cramped quarters, writers, readers, and literature gathered. It was intimate. It was far-reaching. It was alive. And it was at the center of a transformation, the birth of the modern American bookstore. And I call it a modern American bookstore because it was distinctly different than its predecessors. So in the United States, even before it was the United States in colonial times, the places that sold books often had the books separated from customers and browsers by clerks, moats, essentially, books that were behind cupboards or glass doors. These weren't browsing friendly spaces where people could happen upon books. And if they weren't intended to browse, they weren't also intended to be places to linger and to inhabit. But the old corner shop here was decidedly different. There were nooks and crannies, there were books aplenty, and there were, of course, all of these different people. One of its most famous customers was Oliver Wendell Holmes, a great American writer who liked to talk about going to the old corner and tasting books, which I think is a great way to think about sampling and merges with the way in which the English word browse came to mean poking around leisurely in a bookstore or library, a term that was first used to describe how cows munched on vegetation, evolves into this notion of people poking around, tasting books. There were no events, there were no author talks, there were no, author signings or other kind of exhibitions to draw people to this space. But every day was an event of sort. And every day was a place for people to commune together. Today, the Old Corner bookstore, which is long gone, has a coveted spot on several historical trails and markers. It has an architectural significance, but more so a social one. It was once a literary jewel, a place where some of the greatest American authors congregated, and also a regular bookstore, the kind we'd recognize today, where books arrived, were put on the shelf, picked up, tasted, bought, read, and discussed. The Old Corner helped launch American literature and the American bookstore. Today, it's a Chipotle, which I don't know if that means anything in Russia, but is a popular burrito joint, Mexican fast food restaurant. But the exterior of the building is extraordinarily well preserved since the 1820s, and this is very much what it looked like even at the beginning. And even when it was a bookstore, there was a lot of eating going on in a coffee shop next door where people headed over for ice cream and brandy. As much as bookstores are places to find community, they are also places to lose oneself. For every chatty customer, there's another who prefers to be left alone, to be by oneself among others, to feel a book's heft, to savor slowed time. Plenty of people who came to the Old Corner, just like plenty of people shopping in bookstores today, want to be left alone. The Old Corner was in Boston, which was the capital of American publishing, printing, and bookselling from the colonial period until the middle of the 19th century. And there was good reason for these overlapping industries to accumulate, or at least to gather around one another. Bookstores tend to be gregarious, and many of these bookstores are even on the same block. And there are a couple of neighborhoods that get to be known as these very literary neighborhoods. But New York grows into the largest American city and essentially and eventually the literary capital of the United States. And this is just an image from one early New York City bookstore. This is from the 1830s. A guy named Daniel Appleton, who was from Boston, had his own general goods store, who eventually sells some books on the side and then opens his own dedicated bookstore. And I highlight it because of the images that follow showcase a very different kind of bookstore model that was popular in the 19th century. And these are bookstores that are very ornate, grand. This is a photograph from 1854 of this bookstore that was located in Manhattan on Broadway. And you can see this very elaborate Greek revival design here. But even more interesting is what the inside of this bookstore looked like. Here was a place to appreciate books as works of art. You could get Shakespeare bound in fine leather. The store itself was a destination, a place to suggest that you belonged to a certain class and had a certain cachet. And so the space with these very fancy ceiling medallions and columns and frescoes treated books as these almost holy kind of objects. Even still, and it may not have been as comfortable as the old corner, it was still intended as a place for community, a place to hang out and linger. And it's a bit hard to see, but toward the one side of the image, there's a mother sitting in a chair who's reading to her child. So this was a very different kind of space, but what set it off from other kinds of retail outlets was that the bookshop was an experience, and the atmosphere of these spaces was vital. Bookstores stimulate our senses, and sociologists have found that just growing up in a house full of books, whether or not your parents read them, still confers a lifetime of intellectual benefits. Books offer warmth, comfort, refuge, and at the same time are imbued with a near Holy Spirit. Many of us wince at the idea of throwing a book in the trash. That's part of the reason why walking into a bookstore can sort of feel like walking into a sacred space. So one of the things I'm interested in is how these atmospheres, how the experience of bookstore browsing changed over time. What did they feel like? What did they smell like? So going back in time, the first chapter in this book, I profile a bookstore that was older than even the United States, a colonial bookstore that was started by Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's bookstore was comparatively noisy. All the foot traffic, the regular deliveries, the thundering presses, and the groans of men working them. The books looked and felt different too. But what did the store smell like? By and large, customers stank. Soap was expensive. The same clothes were worn over and over. Baths were special occasions. Then there was the scent of ink in the barrels, on the pages, and on everyone's hands and aprons. The books had a distinctive aroma as well. Most of the odorants we sense when we smell books are volatile organic compounds, chemicals released over time as the various inks, glues, bindings, and paper decay. Many of today's materials are intended to prolong the lives of books. Doing so introduces new chemicals and new smells. A lot of people like the scent of a book. It reminds them of something, usually books. It conjures memories of a nose buried in a paperback, the children's section of a local library, or the aisles of a used bookstore. Some say they prefer the smell of a Penguin paperback, and it must be Penguin. Some think old books smell a bit like chocolate. Others find the smell, possibly dusty, musty, mildewy, offensive. Some lose their taste for it. The sweet smell of decaying paper appeals to me no longer, George Orwell, a one-time secondhand bookseller, wrote. It is too closely associated in my mind with paranoia customers and dead blue bottles. Nevertheless, Powell's, a famed independent bookstore in Portland, decided to bottle the aroma. In 2020, it started selling Powell's by Powell's, a unisex fragrance. For $24.99, customers could buy a 1-ounce glass bottle that arrived in a neat red box shaped like a book. The fragrance offered notes of wood and violet, invoking a labyrinth of books, secret libraries, ancient scrolls, and cognac swilled by philosopher kings. It promised to take the wearer to a place of wonder and magic only known in literature. Basically, it was supposed to smell like Powell's, to serve as a sensorial reminder of the physical, very real, not online places where you can still buy books. The reviews were mixed. A customer named Chris raved about the odor of old books with a hint of vanilla. But there was one problem. His wife hated it. Powell's and other bookstores have turned to anything other than books in order to keep selling books. In addition to the bottled bookstore smell, Powell's has ventured into craft beer in collaboration with a local brewery and with part of the proceeds going to charity. Powell's introduced a limited edition hoppy IPA called City of Books. Thankfully, the beer doesn't taste like bookstore. So being surrounded by the sights and smells of books, being book wrapped, surrounded by books physically, has long been the draw. And in the earliest bookstores, not only were the books separated from browsers, but the books were often small, pamphlet-like, not very colorful. And bookstores changed in many ways alongside the design of books themselves, but also precipitated some of those changes. Today, the people who design the cover of books like mine are often focused on how the book looks on a screen. How is it going to appear to shoppers on Amazon? But no matter what the books look like, booksellers, whether it's Amazon or those working inside a bookstore, have been the ones that have led us to read certain kinds of books and not others. The bookstore has been and remains an influencer, a place of discovery. What we read is dictated by what authors choose to write, what publishers choose to publish, and what, where, and how booksellers choose to sell. All bookstores are, in a way, institutions that reflect the cultural, intellectual, economic, and political world around them, but they cast their own shadows. Ben Franklin, seen here, helped stir the American Revolution, in part from behind the counter of his own bookstore. Inside Bookshops, it's the tables and shelves and lighting that point us in certain directions. The books that are stacked super tall on tables are the ones that get noticed. Books that have their cover facing out instead of spine out are much more likely to be noticed. Just a few weeks ago, there's a popular chain bookstore in the United States, and my father-in-law sent me a picture. He found my book in the store, but it was spine out, and he took it and changed its position to be more conspicuous, which I appreciated, but surely the store did not. But booksellers exert their own influence. When we engage with a trusted bookseller, when they tell us to buy a certain book, we often do. And in fact, shoppers are about twice as likely to leave a brick and mortar bookstore with a book they didn't expect to find, or even know about than if they had browsed online. So while internet booksellers might know who we are and where we live and which books and electric toothbrushes we've bought in the past, the neighborhood bookstore remains an influencer. And I have just a short part of my book where I talk briefly about experiencing this sense from the other side, so to speak, from my own experience working briefly at Three Lives, the shop I mentioned at the beginning. One time, Toby asked if I could help. A few of the booksellers were out sick. And so there I was working my first and only shift at Three Lives. I certainly won't ever forget it, in part because when I went down to the basement to fetch something out of storage, I forgot to duck my head. Aside from several minutes spent with an ice pack glued to my forehead, I mostly remember how empowering it felt. People came in and asked me what they should read. Such responsibility, such privilege, such power. Why would they trust a total stranger? Although I had never met the customers before, they didn't think of me as such. The reputation, authority, and comfort of Three Lives was for one day vested in me. The shop conveyed a sense of expertise. It suggested that the people working there knew what they were talking about. When I married one of its booksellers on a Sunday afternoon, Three Lives and Company closed. A little sign on the door announced, "Amanda's getting married." It was as if Manhattan had turned into a small town. Surely there were readers who came hungry and left disappointed, annoyed even. Other customers surely understood. Some of them were at the wedding. So while I was hand selling books to random people and suggesting my favorites, there have been bookstores that introduced entire genres of literature to people who would have never found those kind of books or authors anywhere else. And one that I highlight with a chapter in the book was called the Gotham Book Mart, which was also in New York City for almost 100 years. Frances Steloff sat at her alcove desk at the back of the shop. Customers coming to look for her, and they always did, might trip over one of the too many tables topped by too many books, or one of the cats named after novelists. Even if they made it past furry Thornton Wilder and the oversized table up front covered with little magazines, and then through the maze of rare and first editions, sprawling up, down, and across the shelves, and past the experimental literature section with towers of books on the floor, walking by paintings, drawings, and photographs of Joyce, Pound, Woolf, and O'Neill that hung crooked on the wall, past the books on cinema and the section devoted to theater, and Steloff's personal favorite, the room stuffed with religion and philosophy. They might still have trouble spotting her, a slight woman with steely blue eyes and wispy gray hair, sitting amid a jungle of notes, files, envelopes, letters, mailing lists, paper clips, receipts, bank statements, catalogs, rubber bands, galleys, and cups of cantaloupe. She loved fruit. But if they did manage to find her, she, in turn, would find them just the right book. Frances Steloff was the Gotham Book Mart. The Gotham Book Mart was Frances Steloff. She, along with the writers and readers who congregated there, turned Gotham into a powerhouse. According to the editors of one academic journal, no other American bookstore has done more to encourage experimentation in modern literature. It was also a home, literally. Steloff lived in a third-floor apartment above the shop, often slept outside on the balcony, and came bouncing down the stairs with a pencil tucked somewhere in her hair, which she never seemed to fuss over. But it was more than a home and more than a bookshop. It was a museum, art gallery, therapist's couch, disheveled English professor's office, grandmother's living room, and Parisian cafe, all wrapped in one. So this was a remarkable woman who started one of the most remarkable bookstores in the world. And she, once she became such a prominent figure in American bookselling, had real power, who would often advise publishers about what kinds of books they should be publishing, and who acted as an almost de facto literary agent for some of her customers, advising on their book proposals, potential book covers, subject matter, and was also really a kind of networker who introduced authors to editors and vice versa. And many of the works that she became a strong proponent of were works that were hard to find, sometimes works that were even banned in the United States thanks to censorship efforts. So in particular, she sold works by Henry Miller and James Joyce. On occasion, they also didn't like the window display because of the books that it was promoting. And this is an example of a very famous installation that was done by two artists, one of whom was Marcel Duchamp, the famous modernist who co-designed this window display. And the most prominent piece is this kind of central mannequin with a spigot jutting out of her right thigh here. But to Steloff's surprise, it wasn't the scantily clad Fawcett girl that bothered censorship agents, but rather a poster in the background that featured a bare breast, and she later covered it up in mockery with a bib that says censored. And I love this photograph because you can see in the image near the spigot, Marcel Duchamp himself posing for this photograph. So she was, in the United States, arguably the most ardent champion of James Joyce, and was charged with violating decency laws for selling his books. And she later launched what became known as the James Joyce Society out of her own bookstore. And one of the favorite things I learned over the course of my research was that although she was willing to test the limits of the law to support Joyce, and although she helped start this club that was devoted to his work, she never actually read anything that James Joyce ever wrote. She didn't really care about James Joyce, but her customers did. And if they thought he was genius, that was good enough. A very fascinating character, and I just like to show this image. This was at one point Francis Steloff's desk, which hopefully makes everyone feel better about their own tidiness or lack thereof. Steloff also helped build a kind of transatlantic network of booksellers who were dealing in modernist literature. Most famously was Sylvia Beach, who started a Shakespeare and Company in Paris, this hub for American and other expats. This is an English language bookstore in the hub of Paris where Joyce and Eliot, Pound, Stein, and so many others congregated and liked to hang out. And this was a shop that when Frances Steloff got married and had a honeymoon, this is where she went to celebrate her new marriage. And these were just kind of, in many ways, parallel kinds of bookstores. I highlight in the book other kinds of politically oriented bookstores. So this is an example of a bookstore that opened in Washington, D.C. in the late 60s called Drum and Spear, that was intended to promote civil rights and address race relations. That was started by a number of civil rights activists to promote books by Black authors, and was again started out of a very activist kind of angle, and was meant to help people find the right kind of books, but also to introduce people to other kinds of perhaps like-minded people. So finding, the right book, and finding the right kind of bookstore, of course, is always tricky, and is always a delight when we stumble upon just the perfect book for us. And there's a kind of one of the interesting themes about what a bookstore offers is this place of discovery, but that discovery is also often feels serendipitous. So at the Gotham Book Mart, you saw Frances Deloff's desk. She wasn't the most clean, tidy person. And when somebody took over for her, he lamented that every time he straightened things out, the customers got angry. In a recent book that I read from a woman named Elisa Gabbert, she writes an essay about browsing the books that had just been returned at the library, but not yet reshelved. And she writes, "I need randomness to be happy." And I like that line, because I think even though bookstores may not be random, the joy of traipsing through them and finding just the right book can feel random. And sometimes we don't even go into a bookstore, but sometimes a bookstore finds us. And I have a chapter on the book about mobile bookstores. These became popular in the 1920s. There was a novel by Christopher Morley called Parnassus on Wheels, which was this romantic look at a couple who have this bookmobile and travel around the country selling books. And fiction, in this case, bled into real life. And a number of these mobile bookmobiles cropped up. And most of them disappeared by the time of the Great Depression during the 1930s. There were also some brief-lived attempts of book vending machines, which I found interesting. The one on the left is from the founder of Penguin Books, Sir Alan Lane, who had this idea. The idea of basically Penguin Books was to democratize reading and bring books to the masses. And so what better way than a kind of vending machine on a platform, a subway platform. And in the United States, this happened in a couple of instances, but very rarely. And there's actually a vending machine that has reappeared in England that I just think are interesting. But I spend more time talking about sidewalk bookstores, and some of the most famous, which are outside the scope of my book, are found in Paris along the river here, that have their own hundreds and hundreds of year history. They date back to the 16th century, in fact. But the modern kind of sidewalk bookstores that I write about, there were some throughout the 20th century. This is from 1938 in New York City, really extensions of bookstores on a block that became known as Book Row, 4th Avenue in New York City, this congregation of bookstores. But in the 1980s, this is a picture from later, but beginning in the 1980s, New York City passes a law that grants booksellers the right to sell on the street without a license. And before this, if you wanted to sell books, just as if you want to sell ice cream or any other kind of item, you needed to be licensed by the city. But this was an argument in favor of a kind of freedom of speech vein, that booksellers shouldn't need a license to be able to sell. And so beginning in the 1980s, these sidewalk bookstores pop up all over the city. And I highlight a few in the book, including, well, I should just say, one of the challenges for booksellers on the sidewalk became, these were begun in the 1980s, but throughout the 20th and even more so the 21st century, people bought more books online, gravitated toward ebooks, which of course have no secondhand market, carried less cash than they used to, and had their eyes fixed on their cell phones, failing to notice the booksellers right in front of them. And I was just in Richmond, Virginia, and took a picture of the campus there that now, at least Americans are so obsessed with their phones, we walk around staring down at them that it's hard to notice whether or not anyone would be selling books on the streets. But I do profile this woman here. So a couple of adventurous souls didn't get into the business of book selling on the sidewalks until after the industry had already collapsed. Jen Fisher was born in Florida, a fact she seems embarrassed about. She arrived in New York with $400, loved books, frequented bookstores, ran some errands for some bookseller friends of hers, and decided to set up a sidewalk bookstore of her own. Her table is typically stocked with art and film, poetry, philosophy, and literary fiction. She has a soft spot for various poets, but a strong dislike for Paul Auster. I won't sell Auster because then I'll have to talk about him. Fisher scouts for books across the country, mostly in the winter, that she can flip quickly. But it's not about economics. She sells only what feels right or what's likely to provoke stimulating conversations. She stows the books in the back of her large blue Buick. From trunk to the table and back to the trunk, she moves them with care. The hardcovers are covered in Mylar. A book that spends a day outside can age a year. When she's tired of standing, she takes a seat on the hood of a car. It's exhausting, she said, when asked why there aren't more sidewalk sellers. Plus, the rent's too high. She likens her sidewalk bookstore to a barbershop. What she does mostly is listen. Some people want to talk about books. Some just want to talk. Most of her buyers don't shop at the indoor bookstores. Some of them are difficult. Sidewalk book selling is intense, tiring, and far from lucrative. But, she added, it is also really magical. And this notion of a bookstore as a kind of magical place is one of the reasons that there are so many movies, books, and other kind of pop culture elements which feature bookstores. And so I don't know how familiar this audience will be with, this is an image from a movie called You've Got Mail. But I'm going to end my sort of lecture portion here by reading just a last bit from the book. When I told people that I was writing this book, the most common response, other than when will you be finished, was in one way or another about You've Got Mail. Have you seen it? Yes. Are you going to write about it? Yes. Maybe you can interview Tom Hanks. Maybe. Aside from Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, Hugh Grant in Notting Hill, and Audrey Hepburn in Funny Face both play memorable and remarkably good-looking booksellers. Both find love rather than first editions. To be sure, these films are sappy and tropey, and many books about bookstores can easily be dismissed as navel-gazing, a la Hollywood's propensity to make movies about Hollywood. But there's a reason why screenwriters and book writers love setting their stories in bookstores. They can be romantic spaces, places full of discovery, of chance, of wonder. Whether in mysteries or memoirs, travelogues or true crime tales, romances or rom-coms, horror or history, bookstores can be more than just passive backdrops. Bookstores can be actors. Bookstores, even the little ones, can shape the world around them. They already have. So that's plenty of material that I had prepared to share. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have that I think will be fed to me. And I see a couple in the queue already. So one question is about the market for books. It's if soap was expensive, how affordable were books? And that's an excellent question. So one of the principal challenges that booksellers felt early on in American history was that there was a relatively small amount of literate colonists compared to what became public schooling, and having sort of well-read children only becomes popularized later in time. So there's a relatively small market of people who can read, but an even smaller market of people who could afford books. So they were considerably more expensive than they are today or were throughout most of American history. And for a lot of people who worked in the book business, let's say they worked, in a bookstore or one of these colonial print houses, they were not the kind of people who could afford a book. So the kind of people buying books were more like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, people who were extremely learned, but also had deep enough pockets to spend money on books because the cost of making them was quite prohibitive. And most of the books that colonists were reading were still imported from other places in the world, primarily England. So there was a lot of time and costs just in terms of acquiring inventory. Another question here is, was it possible to read a book in a store and then put it back on the shelf without buying it? And yes, going around bookstores and sampling books was one of the ways in which bookstores became inviting spaces. Now, the owner or bookseller may not want people to treat it like a library. So some bookstores early on had circulating libraries where they would loan out books for a small fee. But the notion of a library where people could take out books for free became popularized only in the second half of the 19th century. So the earliest bookstores really had no rivalry with libraries and didn't want to be treated as such. And sometimes there could be consternation between browser and bookseller about somebody hanging out too long without buying anything. But then there were bookstores that came about in the 20th century, and the most popular American chain was and is Barnes and Noble. And one of the things that set Barnes and Noble apart is that they had couches and chairs and tables, and most of the stores had cafes where they were serving Starbucks coffee. They really invited people to hang out in the store. And it wasn't so important that everyone coming bought something, but they thought that that kind of energy, having people come into the store, would make it a more lively space and would eventually help sales as well. All right, I'm looking at the queue here at the next question. What inspired me to write this book? My own connections with bookstores growing up. So I grew up in a suburb of Baltimore, Maryland, and I didn't have a real special bookstore near to me. There was a Barnes and Noble, which is a chain bookstore that I sometimes visited, but I wasn't the kind of person to sort of live there. And it really wasn't until I moved to New York City. I was in graduate school studying history. And from what I read a bit in the book, my girlfriend got a job at this small bookstore. And it was really through that proxy experience that I began to realize for some people how important bookstores were. And that really wasn't for me growing up. I was a serious reader. I spent a lot of time at the library, but I began to unearth this world in which bookstores were vital spaces for some people and how much they meant to some people. And that's what inspired me to write this book. Another question is about reading trends among my students. So I'll answer this maybe in a couple different ways. My university students, and I think this is an affliction. I don't know if this is global. Certainly read considerably less than students used to when I first started in academia, and which is unfortunate. And there's certainly the kinds of books people are reading in the U.S. has changed. So there's a kind of current trend toward romance books and fantasy books. They're even blended in this genre called romantasy books that many teenagers and 20-somethings are drawn to, and even some new romance-themed bookstores that have opened up catering to this genre. So there are, of course, constantly changing trends in literature and what people are reading, which makes it difficult to be a bookseller, to think about how to curate your stock and what kind of customers you have, and how to shift your focus accordingly to the market. There's a question about how the role of bookstores in the United States compares to those in other countries. And this is a question I'm really interested in. And like I said, I came across some foreign language bookstores that were in the United States, including Russian bookstores. But I know remarkably little, too little, about bookselling cultures elsewhere. I am very curious. But I will say some of the comparisons that are often made are usually related to Europe, Western Europe, England, and that there is some sense, at least in the United States, that maybe other countries and cultures have done more to protect bookstores as part of their cultural and historical legacy. One of the big issues here in the United States, of course, if not birthplace, at least the kind of poster child of capitalism, is how has the American government sort of played a role in protecting or not protecting small businesses, and bookstores fall into that discussion about the power of Amazon, anti-monopoly practices, and what other kind of levers could be pulled to help save small businesses, including bookstores. So in France, for example, there are a variety of essentially anti-Amazon laws that prevent bookstores from discounting books so that there's a level playing field, or that prevents Amazon from having €0 delivery fees. These are efforts to sort of limit Amazon's market share. And that hasn't happened in the United States, although some of those desires depend on political preferences and ideologies. Another great question about ebooks and audiobooks and how this connects to a loss of community. So when ebooks are first popularized, lots of pundits, booksellers, writers, everyone else has good reason to think that bookstores are going to die. Everybody's going to read digitally, and there'll be no home for the brick and mortar bookstore. But it turned out, at least in the United States, the appetite for e-readers plateaued, and there was enough of a market for bookstores to continue to exist, although the number and financial success dwindled. Audiobooks have become much more popular in the last few years and holds a similar threat to how we get our books. If they're digitally supplied, obviously the need for these brick and mortar spaces become much less so. So how do you draw people into the bookstore? How do you keep a bookstore as a center of community if more and more people are downloading books to listen to or to read digitally is one of the fundamental challenges, and is creating a precarious landscape for booksellers. Then there's a question about large bookstore chains like Barnes and Noble versus independent shops. One of the interesting things is when Barnes and Noble becomes popular in the 1990s, more so, in early 2000s, a war ensues between small bookstores where there's one branch or two versus Barnes and Noble, which at a point has hundreds and hundreds of giant bookstores. And they're very much at odds with one another. But in more recent times, because Amazon has become the biggest player in American book selling, Barnes and Noble and the small bookshops have more often found themselves as allies instead of competitors. And they are fighting to work together to try and keep in-person brick and mortar book selling alive. And they see their biggest competition as not Barnes and Noble or an indie shop, but rather Amazon, and have been working more closely together to support people in person browsing and buying books. So that's been a very interesting and surprising turn. And then I'm almost out of time here, but there's one more question about international literature, and is there a strong demand for translated works from abroad? And that's a great question. I think it varies from market to market, and probably there used to be a much larger demand for international literature, and I don't know, what the forces are behind that. And of course, there's lots of classic works in other languages, War and Peace, where there are translations coming out all the time, various Greek and Latin kind of works, classics that get retranslated that do have some mainstream appeal. But the dominant players in American readership are oftentimes American authors, not exclusively, of course, but a lot of times, there are Nobel Prize winners from other countries, and their works are being translated, and kind of, at least on the street, rank and file people often are not very familiar with some of these names. There are a lot of exceptions, of course. People read Murakami, who writes in Japanese, and again, classics that I mentioned. But sort of translated works typically occupy a relatively small section of American bookstores, unfortunately, because of course it's a great art, and the world has much to teach us. So I see that I'm almost out of time. I didn't see anybody in the audience, so maybe you all fell asleep or something. I don't know, but I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciated this opportunity. Thanks to everyone for coming out, and thanks to the Moscow Center for having me. Have a good night.